Hillbilly Cosplay. That was the phrase Ilhan Omar chose to throw at the Vice President of the United States on live television in front of roughly 7 million viewers, with the confident smile of a politician who believed she had just manufactured the clip of the night. The gallery erupted. The laughter came fast and sharp. Her aide celebrated offstage. And within minutes, the insult was already racing across social media as if the debate had been decided before JD Vance had even opened his mouth. Omar's team had prepared for exactly this kind of moment, a short, brutal, easily clipped confrontation that could dominate television panels, fundraising emails, partisan accounts, and morning headlines without requiring anyone to examine a single document. She believed she had reduced Vance to a caricature, the poor Appalachian kid who attended Yale, entered politics, and now supposedly wore his past like a costume whenever it helped him sell a political message. What Omar did not understand was that Vance had not entered the room to defend his identity, his childhood, his education, or his right to speak about hardship, because he had entered the room carrying numbers. The town hall was only 6 minutes old, and by every ordinary measure of modern political television, Ilhan Omar was winning decisively. She had spent the opening minutes moving through Medicaid, immigration raids, the Muslim ban, Mogadishu, the refugee camp in Kenya, and the story of arriving in the United States at 12 years old with little more than survival behind her and ambition in front of her. It was the version of Omar that her supporters admired most, controlled but defiant, personal without sounding fragile, and aggressive enough to make every criticism appear like an attack on someone who had already endured more than her critics could imagine. Her delivery had been polished over years of hearings, rallies, interviews, confrontations, and viral exchanges, and she knew precisely when to shift from policy to biography and from biography to accusation. Then she turned toward Vance, raised her chin, and delivered the line her team had clearly expected to carry the evening. The hillbilly who went to Yale wanted to lecture the refugee who survived a war zone about struggle. The insult worked immediately because it was designed for reaction rather than examination, and reaction is the easiest currency in American political media. Producers reached for their phones, reporters began cutting the clip, partisan accounts attached captions before the laughter had even faded, and Omar's communications operation treated the moment like a completed mission. Hillbilly Cosplay was not merely an insult in their calculation. It was a compact political product, short enough for every platform, cruel enough to energize supporters, and personal enough to bury whatever policy discussion came next. In the green room, her communications director sent a single celebratory word to the staff group chat because there appeared to be nothing else to say when the internet was already doing the distribution work for them. Omar had thrown the punch, the audience had rewarded her, and the machinery surrounding her assumed JD Vance would now make the predictable mistake of responding emotionally. But Vance did not argue about the word hillbilly, did not accuse Omar of elitism, did not raise his voice, and did not offer a sentimental defense of the family history she had just mocked. He looked down at his laptop, moved his fingers across the keyboard, and allowed several seconds of silence to stretch across a room that had been expecting anger, outrage, or at least a visibly wounded reaction. That silence was not hesitation, because nothing in his posture suggested that he was searching for an answer. It was the silence of someone waiting for the noise to exhaust itself before beginning an entirely different proceeding. Omar had prepared for a debate in which the weapons would be identity, biography, policy language, moral accusation, and the emotional authority of personal experience. Vance had prepared for an audit, and an audit does not care whether the person being audited has delivered a powerful opening statement. When the moderator finally turned to him, Vance still did not look at Omar because acknowledging the insult would have elevated it into the center of the exchange. He simply stated that he appreciated the introduction and that the hillbilly would now read from FEC filings, delivering the sentence with such flat control that the original attack suddenly began to look less like a knockout and more like an opening Omar might regret creating. There was no outrage in his answer, no dramatic pause designed to invite sympathy, and no attempt to compete with her performance by offering a performance of his own. The emotional temperature in the room shifted because the audience realized that Vance was not going to fight on the ground Omar had selected for him. She had brought a sharpened insult while he had brought federal campaign records, and only one of those could still be examined after the applause disappeared. Vance began with Omar for Congress and the payments reported to a Washington political consulting operation known as E Street Group. According to the records presented in the script, the campaign paid approximately $2.78 million to that firm during 2019 and 2020, a number large enough to demand attention even before the personal relationship behind the company entered the discussion. E Street Group was owned by Tim Mynett, the political consultant who was involved with Omar personally and whom she married in 2020. Vance's point was not that campaigns are forbidden from paying consultants, because campaigns pay consultants constantly, and no serious person disputes that basic fact. His point was that describing the arrangement as routine became much harder when millions in donor funds flowed into a business owned by the person the candidate was dating and later married. That distinction cut through Omar's intended defense before she had fully delivered it, because standard campaign practice sounds much less reassuring when the consultant receiving the payments shares the candidate's home, finances, and family interests. Vance did not need to accuse Omar of committing a crime in order to expose the political ugliness of the arrangement, and he did not need to shout in order to make the room understand why ordinary donors might want an explanation. The issue was not whether E Street Group performed campaign work, because the deeper question concerned judgment, transparency, incentives, and the extraordinary convenience of donor money entering a company controlled by the candidate's future husband. Every dollar had arrived from people who believed they were financing political representation, voter outreach, organizing, advertisements, staff, and a movement that claimed to fight for communities ignored by Washington. Once $2.78 million entered a spouse-connected company, the burden was no longer on critics to explain why the arrangement looked bad. The burden was on Omar to explain why supporters should regard it as acceptable. Vance then narrowed the argument from millions of dollars to one donor, because numbers become politically dangerous when the public can see the human sacrifice behind them. He introduced Amamira Noor, a woman from Cedar Riverside, the Minneapolis neighborhood, often called Little Mogadishu, and located within the political community Omar had repeatedly presented herself as uniquely qualified to represent. Amamira worked as a prep cook at a Somali restaurant, earned approximately $26,000 a year, and had reportedly donated $50 each month to Omar's campaign since 2018. Over 6 years, that amounted to roughly $3,600, an enormous personal commitment for someone living on a modest income and likely measuring every expense against rent, groceries, transportation, utilities, and family obligations. Her contributions did not come from excess wealth, corporate access, or the expectation of influence. They came from belief. That was the reason Vance's presentation was more damaging than a conventional partisan attack, because he was not describing donor money as an abstract pool created by nameless political enthusiasts. He was describing a woman who worked long hours, earned little, repeatedly gave what she could, and believed that Omar represented people like her against institutions that rarely noticed them. $50 might appear insignificant inside a multi-million-dollar campaign report, but on a $26,000 salary, it represents skipped purchases, postponed needs, tighter grocery decisions, and trust expressed through sacrifice. Amamira gave because Omar was one of us, a phrase that carried the entire moral foundation of the representative's political identity and her relationship with the Somali American community. Vance's attack was therefore not merely that money had gone to a consulting firm, but that the sacrifice of working class supporters had traveled directly into a company owned by the man Omar later married. Omar leaned toward her microphone and attempted the obvious defense, insisting that campaign payments to political consultants were ordinary and widely practiced across American politics. Under different circumstances, that answer might have survived because campaign finance is filled with vendors, consultants, strategists, media firms, digital firms, compliance firms, and professional relationships that most voters never examine. Vance answered, without lifting his eyes from the laptop, saying that standard practice does not include marrying the consultant, and the sentence landed precisely because he refused to decorate it. 8 words were enough to collapse a broad procedural defense into a painfully specific personal arrangement, leaving Omar with no easy way to retreat back into the safe language of ordinary campaign operations. She had prepared for attacks on her religion, her refugee history, her immigration positions, her foreign policy statements, and her political ideology, but she had not prepared for a man calmly following donor money through federal records. Vance opened another tab, and the motion began to acquire a rhythm that Omar's team had not anticipated because every click suggested another layer waiting behind the first disclosure. The next name was E.S.T. Crew, a Virginia winery connected to Tim Mynett, the same man whose consulting firm had already received approximately $2.78 million from Omar's campaign. In 2022, according to the sequence presented in the original script, a private investor from Washington placed $300,000 into the winery after being promised an extraordinary return of roughly 200%. The promised return did not arrive. The investor filed a lawsuit, and Mynett eventually settled after the dispute moved into court. What had begun as a question about campaign consulting was now expanding into a pattern involving donor money, a spouse-connected business, an outside investor, a collapsed promise, and a lawsuit required to force accountability. Vance stayed with the timeline because chronology stripped away the fog that political language usually creates around complicated financial arrangements. Omar's campaign supporters sent millions into E Street Group, Mynett's political consulting operation, and Mynett's growing public profile then helped surround his other business ventures with an appearance of access, credibility, and political importance. An investor placed $300,000 into EST Crew, expecting the kind of return that would tempt almost anyone, yet the investment failed to produce what had been promised, and the matter ended in litigation rather than success. The winery later closed, leaving behind no triumphant business story, no spectacular return, and no explanation capable of making the original promise look reasonable in hindsight. Each fact by itself might have been dismissed as an unfortunate business problem, but together they created the image of money entering through one door, being repackaged through another, and disappearing behind excuses that only became visible after someone sued. Omar had expected Vance to defend himself against the insult, but instead she was being forced to watch him construct a chain of financial relationships while the cameras recorded every link. She could not easily accuse him of changing the subject because the subject was the flow of money connected to her campaign, her husband, and businesses that appeared on federal disclosures bearing her name. She could not simply dismiss the investor as a partisan critic because a lawsuit is not a campaign slogan and a settlement is not a television talking point. She could not rely on laughter from the gallery because the gallery had grown quiet enough to hear the clicks of each new tab opening on the laptop. The entire advantage she had built during the first 6 minutes was being dismantled by the most unglamorous material in American politics: filings, business records, addresses, valuations, and dates. Then came Rose Lake Capital, another venture associated with Tim Mynett, and described publicly as a venture capital firm with an astonishing amount of money under management. The firm's website claimed approximately $60 billion in assets, a figure so enormous that it would place Rose Lake among major financial institutions rather than obscure political adjacent startups. Vance allowed that number to sit in the room because it did not need exaggeration, outrage, or theatrical emphasis to sound unbelievable. A company claiming $60 billion in managed assets should possess a visible team, a substantial portfolio, a verifiable investment history, regulatory records, professional infrastructure, and a public footprint proportionate to the scale of the claim. Rose Lake Capital, as presented in the script, had none of those features in any form that justified the number placed on its website. The company was not registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission in the manner expected of a firm operating at that scale, and its listed address led not to a financial headquarters, but to a WeWork co-working location. There was no detailed team page showing the professionals responsible for billions of dollars, no portfolio explaining where the capital had been deployed, and no public record demonstrating the kind of investment activity that would support the claim. The contrast was almost insulting in its simplicity. $60 billion on the website, a rented desk in the real world, and a sitting member of Congress connected to the owner through marriage and federal disclosure forms. Vance did not need to call the claim ridiculous, because the physical address did that work for him more efficiently than any insult could. Omar had mocked Vance as a man wearing a costume, yet the records now pointed toward a venture capital operation dressed in the language of Wall Street, while apparently operating from space rented by the hour. Vance returned to Amamira Nur because the argument became sharper whenever he traced the distance between a small donor's sacrifice and the businesses connected to Omar's household. Amamira's $50 did not arrive in Washington as a meaningless accounting unit because it represented trust from a worker earning approximately $26,000 annually and repeatedly choosing Omar's campaign over something she could have purchased for herself. That money joined thousands of other donations, flowed into campaign accounts, moved toward E Street Group, and became part of a financial ecosystem that included a failed winery and a venture capital firm claiming $60 billion from a WeWork address. Vance described the movement as a sequence of doors, each one carrying the donor farther from the political mission she believed she was financing and closer to private business arrangements she had never been asked to approve. By the final door, the rhetoric of movement politics had been replaced by the image of a rented desk, an empty corporate claim, and a donor who still believed her money was helping her neighborhood. The cruelty of the comparison came from its precision rather than its volume, because Vance never had to accuse Amamira of being naive, or Omar of personally stealing every dollar she contributed. He only had to ask whether a woman donating from a modest salary deserved to understand how campaign money became entangled with the private ventures of the representative's husband. Omar's political identity had always rested heavily on the claim that she carried the voice of people who had been ignored, marginalized, displaced, and treated as invisible by powerful institutions. Yet the documents were creating the opposite picture, one in which ordinary supporters provided the money while the people closest to power controlled the companies receiving it. The contradiction was devastating because Omar could not solve it by describing herself as an outsider when the records placed her family at the center of the financial arrangement. Vance opened the next set of documents, and 3 federal financial disclosures appeared side by side, each asking substantially the same question and each providing a dramatically different answer. The 2023 disclosure placed Tim Mynett's total business assets at approximately $51,000, a modest valuation consistent with a consulting firm and an interest in a small winery. The following disclosure, filed in May 2025 for the 2024 reporting period, listed business holdings somewhere between $6 million and $30 million, including EST Crew at between $1 million and $5 million, and Rose Lake Capital at between $5 million and $25 million. An amended disclosure, filed in March 2026, then reduced the same general category to somewhere between $18,000 and $95,000, while Rose Lake Capital and the winery effectively disappeared from the asset picture. The same household, the same federal disclosure process, and the same underlying business interests had somehow produced numbers that moved from tens of thousands to tens of millions, and then back down again. Omar's explanation characterized the discrepancy as an accounting error, but that phrase became almost absurd when placed beside the scale of the correction. This was not a misplaced decimal involving a restaurant bill, a duplicated reimbursement, or a minor valuation adjustment that an ordinary person might reasonably overlook. The difference approached $29.9 million, enough to transform a financially ordinary household into one associated with extraordinary wealth before reversing the transformation in a later filing. Vance calculated that the gap represented roughly 1,150 years of Amamira's annual salary, bringing the discussion back to the person whose $50 contributions had made the campaign's financial machinery possible. Calling that kind of difference an accounting error did not clarify the record. It revealed how desperately Omar needed the public to treat a massive contradiction as routine paperwork. The camera caught Omar reaching for her water with a speed that exposed more than thirst because her hands needed an assignment while the three documents remained visible. Her attorney leaned forward from behind her and whispered something brief, and Omar responded with a small shake of the head that suggested advice had been offered and rejected without either side wanting the audience to hear it. For several minutes, the woman who had opened the evening with total command of the room had said almost nothing while Vance moved through filings carrying her signature. The silence mattered because Omar's political reputation had been built on refusing silence, confronting opponents, interrupting evasions, reclaiming time, and turning every attack into another opportunity to speak. Now, the records had created a question that biography could not answer, applause could not erase, and an insult delivered 40 minutes earlier could no longer distract anyone from asking. Omar finally pushed back, not because the documents had disappeared, not because the discrepancies had been resolved, and not because the millions connected to her husband's companies had suddenly become easier to explain, but because silence had become more dangerous than confrontation. She reached for the political architecture that had protected her through years of attacks, combining the refugee story, the Muslim ban, immigration raids, frightened families, and the accusation that powerful men always examine the people who refuse to submit. Her response moved quickly away from E Street Group, EST Crew, Rose Lake Capital, the WeWork address, and the disclosure forms, because those subjects offered no emotional ground on which she could regain control. She accused Vance of discussing her husband's business instead of children separated at the border, communities targeted by federal policy, and immigrants living under the pressure of raids and political hostility. The strategy was familiar, forceful, and effective in almost every previous confrontation because it replaced the question being asked with a larger moral indictment of the person asking it. Her voice carried genuine fury, and that fury mattered because Omar did not sound like a politician reciting a prepared defense so much as a woman who believed the examination itself was an assault on everything she represented. She had survived war, displacement, a refugee camp, a foreign language, a new country, and the suspicion that followed her into American politics, and she understood how to convert that history into authority whenever opponents attempted to corner her. Supporters in the gallery began to clap, first cautiously, and then with the confidence of people who recognized the rhythm of a comeback they had seen many times before. For several seconds, Omar appeared to recover the room by widening the issue from a financial disclosure problem into a struggle over religion, race, immigration, and the right of a refugee to hold power without being treated as permanently suspect. The applause was real, the emotion was real, and the biography was real, but none of it answered why the same federal forms had carried wildly different numbers. Vance waited for the noise to settle without interrupting, because interrupting would have allowed Omar to claim that he was proving the very point she had just made. He had watched similar storms before, and he understood that emotional force becomes less useful when the other person refuses to compete with it. When he spoke, his voice remained quiet, almost administrative, as though he were correcting an entry in a report rather than responding to an accusation delivered before millions of viewers. He said he had not mentioned Omar's religion, immigration status, the Muslim ban, or the border, and then returned directly to the subjects displayed on the screen. He had mentioned FEC filings, financial disclosures, a WeWork address, millions paid to her husband's company, a failed winery dispute, and numbers submitted on federal forms. That response cut away the shield Omar had attempted to raise because Vance refused to walk through the political door she had opened. He did not debate the refugee story, question her suffering, challenge her faith, or accuse her of using identity dishonestly, because doing any of those things would have allowed the financial record to disappear behind a louder cultural fight. Instead, he stated that the numbers were the numbers, and that the issue was not who Omar was, where she came from, or what her critics believed about her place in America. The issue was that approximately $2.78 million had gone from her campaign to a company owned by the man she married, while other ventures connected to that same man produced lawsuits, extraordinary claims, and federal disclosures that changed by nearly $29.9 million. He ended the distinction with one word that stripped the entire exchange of its theatrical protection: arithmetic. Arithmetic was brutal because arithmetic did not care which side of the gallery applauded, which network preferred which candidate, or which biography carried more emotional force. A financial form could not be accused of prejudice. A business address could not be shamed into changing, and three conflicting valuations could not all become accurate simply because the person signing them had survived genuine hardship. Omar had tried to convert the issue from documentation into discrimination, but Vance refused the conversion and kept the audience inside the narrow room where the figures remained visible. In that room, there was no convenient escape through ideology, no argument about immigration capable of making a $60 billion website claim more credible, and no history of persecution capable of making a $29.9 million discrepancy smaller. The strategy worked because it did not deny Omar's story. It demonstrated that her story was not an answer. Vance then closed the laptop, and for the first time in nearly 47 minutes, the screen went dark, signaling that the audit had reached its final entry. He looked directly at Omar, not at the gallery, not at the moderator, and not at the camera, because the confrontation had finally returned to the insult that had opened the evening. He reminded the room that Omar had called him a hillbilly playing dress-up, then dismissed the personal sting by saying he had been called worse by better. The line did not attempt to compete with her cruelty, and that restraint made her original insult appear smaller than it had sounded when the room first exploded with laughter. 47 minutes of filings had changed Hillbilly Cosplay from a devastating attack into evidence that Omar had entered the night armed with ridicule while Vance had entered with records. He referenced the lesson his grandmother had given him that people attack your shoes when they cannot attack your work, and the line landed differently because the audience had now watched him spend almost an hour discussing Omar's work rather than her clothing, background, faith, or accent. The original insult had suggested that Vance's identity was a costume, a performance created by a Yale graduate who continued to present himself as a product of Appalachian hardship. After the documents, the question of performance had shifted toward the financial operation connected to Omar's campaign and household, where political language about community sacrifice existed beside consulting payments, venture claims, amended valuations, and a rented office. Vance did not need to declare that Omar was the one performing because the contrast had already been built through the sequence of documents. He only needed to let the audience compare the man reading federal filings with the woman who had attempted to defeat those filings by changing the subject. He returned once more to Amamira Nure, the donor whose $50 monthly contribution had become the moral center of the entire presentation. She worked for modest wages, donated repeatedly, and trusted Omar because she believed that a woman from her own community would understand the value of every dollar sacrificed by families who did not possess millions. Vance described the journey of that money through 6 doors, from a small donor to a campaign, from the campaign to E Street Group, from the consulting operation into the orbit of private ventures, and finally toward a company claiming enormous assets from a WeWork desk. The image was deliberately simple because the financial structure was complicated enough to hide behind technical language, while 6 doors and a rented desk could be understood by anyone watching from a kitchen table. Amamira had not donated to help construct a mystery, and she had not skipped personal expenses so that her representative could later dismiss questions about the money as political persecution. Vance said Amamira deserved an answer from Omar, not from him, because the responsibility belonged to the person who had accepted the donor's trust and signed the federal disclosures. He did not claim that every contribution had been stolen, did not invent a criminal conviction, and did not pretend that every business failure automatically proved illegal conduct. He made the narrower and more politically devastating argument that donors deserve to know how millions reached a spouse-owned company and why the financial values attached to that household had changed so dramatically across sworn forms. That distinction protected the attack from becoming careless because he did not need an exaggerated accusation when the documented arrangement already looked indefensible. Omar had entered the evening expecting to place Vance on trial for hypocrisy, privilege, and political cruelty, but the laptop had quietly moved the defendant's chair to her side of the stage. Vance closed by returning the word cosplay to the person who had introduced it, asking America to decide who was really wearing a costume. Was it the man reading campaign filings without raising his voice, or the representative whose donor money traveled into a network of family-connected businesses, while one venture claimed $60 billion from a rented workspace and remained unsupported by the public footprint such a figure demanded? He did not add another insult, because adding one would have weakened the comparison and returned the exchange to the theatrical level where Omar had originally been strongest. He shut the laptop, aligned the edges, placed the pen beside it, and stopped speaking with the controlled finality of someone who believed the report no longer required explanation. Omar did not answer, not because Ilhan Omar had suddenly lost the ability to speak, but because every available response required her to address numbers she had spent the evening trying to escape. The room did not erupt when Vance stopped speaking, because what followed was more damaging than applause, boos, or another round of partisan shouting. It was the kind of silence that arrives when an audience realizes the performance has ended, but the evidence remains, sitting there without emotion and without any need for permission. Omar had opened the night believing she could define the confrontation with one insult, yet she now faced the humiliating reality that the insult had occupied 2 minutes while the laptop had occupied 47. In television politics, attention is supposed to reward the sharpest line, the fastest comeback, and the most shareable act of contempt. This time, attention had stayed long enough to watch the joke become the doorway into an audit. Omar left through a side exit, not because she had suddenly become afraid of reporters, but because her attorney advised her to avoid the press waiting outside. That detail mattered because Ilhan Omar had never built her public identity around retreat, caution, or the quiet management of difficult questions. She had built it around confrontation, refusing intimidation, challenging hostile rooms, and turning every attempted ambush into a camera-ready counterattack. Yet, after the town hall, the person directing her movement was not a communication strategist looking for another viral clip, but a lawyer trying to limit further exposure. When legal advice replaces political instinct after a public event, it usually means the numbers on stage have created questions that slogans cannot safely answer. Her communications director waited near the car with 3 statements drafted for the 3 political outcomes the team had expected. One declared victory and accused Vance of hypocrisy, another described the event as a productive exchange, and the third condemned his attacks as partisan and politically motivated. None addressed E Street Group, the $2.78 million in campaign payments, the failed winery investment, Rose Lake Capital, the WeWork address, or the disclosure correction approaching $29.9 million. The team had prepared language for triumph, stalemate, and attack because those are the standard categories used by people who believe every political confrontation is ultimately a messaging problem. They had not prepared a statement for an accounting problem, and accounting does not disappear because a press release refuses to name it. Inside the car, Omar placed her phone face down while notifications arrived faster than she could reasonably process them. She did not need to look because she had already watched the evening change in real time, one tab after another, while the insult she had expected to define the night slowly vanished beneath the record. The vibration continued, carrying headlines, clips, messages, requests for comment, frantic advice, partisan reassurance, hostile celebration, and the unavoidable question her team had not answered. The first clip had given her exactly what she wanted, 40,000 shares in minutes, and a wave of laughter powerful enough to convince her staff that the outcome was settled. The problem was that she had created an audience large enough to watch everything that followed. For the first 6 hours, the internet still appeared to belong to Omar because Hillbilly Cosplay traveled with the speed and simplicity of a perfect political insult. Networks replayed it, activists celebrated it, fundraising language was prepared around it, and partisan feeds treated Vance's refusal to react as proof that the blow had landed. Then the second clip began circulating, the 43-second segment in which Vance said that standard practice did not include marrying the consultant. It contained no shouting, no dramatic camera movement, and no emotional performance, only a federal filing, an 8-word response, and Omar's sudden inability to move the discussion away from her husband's company. By the next morning, that clip had reached approximately 11 million views and had begun replacing the insult as the defining moment. The third clip followed, built around Amamira's monthly donation, and the 6 doors separating her $50 from the WeWork desk connected to Rose Lake Capital. It spread beyond ordinary partisan media because the issue was no longer merely whether Vance had embarrassed Omar during a televised event. Small donor advocates, campaign finance observers, nonprofit watchdogs, business forums, and people with no interest in personality-driven political combat began sharing the sequence. They did not need to admire Vance, dislike Omar, or care about the original insult to understand why millions paid to a spouse-owned firm deserved scrutiny. That clip climbed to roughly 14 million views because the distance between a prep cook's sacrifice and a venture firm's unsupported claims required no ideological translation. The fourth clip placed the 3 financial disclosures side by side and allowed the figures to prosecute the contradiction without commentary. Approximately $51,000 became a range reaching $30 million, then fell back toward $95,000 after an amended filing, all across documents requiring accuracy from the person signing them. The images were more effective than another speech because viewers could pause the screen, read the values, and decide for themselves whether accounting error was remotely adequate. By the 72-hour mark, the combined audience across the major clips had reportedly exceeded 34 million views. Omar's insult had attracted the public, but Vance's documents gave the public a reason to remain. The irony was ruthless because Omar had supplied the marketing campaign for the evidence used against her. Without the insult, the town hall might have produced a few policy clips, a limited audience, and another forgettable round of partisan disagreement. With the insult, millions of people clicked to watch Vance get humiliated and instead encountered FEC payments, spouse-connected companies, a failed winery dispute, a $60 billion claim, a rented office, and wildly changing federal disclosures. She had created the curiosity, generated the traffic, and delivered the opening spectacle at no cost to the person waiting with the laptop. The viral moment worked perfectly, only for the wrong side. During the first week, Omar's office released a statement describing the confrontation as a politically motivated smear targeting a black Muslim woman. The statement returned to identity because identity had protected her before, but it again avoided E Street Group, the $2.78 million EST crew, Rose Lake Capital, the WeWork address, and the $29.9 million discrepancy. At the same time, the FEC reportedly opened an inquiry into campaign disbursements connected to E Street Group, not a criminal conviction and not yet a full investigation, but a formal sign that the records had raised questions beyond television commentary. Under normal conditions, an inquiry might remain a technical footnote buried beneath procedural language and ignored outside specialized reporting. After tens of millions had watched the payments described line by line, the inquiry became the next chapter in a story Omar's staff could no longer contain. By the second week, the political damage had reached Cedar Riverside, where support for Omar had long been protected by loyalty, shared identity, and the belief that attacks against her were attacks against the community itself. The reaction was not uniform because no community moves as a single body, but embarrassment and suspicion began appearing where automatic defense had once been stronger. A Somali language radio host asked why supporters who had defended Omar through every national controversy should not be allowed to ask where their money had gone. The question mattered because it did not come from Vance, a Republican network, or a hostile political organization looking to damage her from outside the district. It came from inside the community whose sacrifice had been converted into the central exhibit of the hearing. By the third week, primary challenger Latonya Reeves used that question in a 15-second advertisement aimed directly at the voters Omar had assumed would remain loyal. The ad centered on Amamira's monthly contributions and the simple demand to know why $2.78 million had been paid to the representative's husband's company. It ran through Somali language media in Cedar Riverside, placing the financial question inside the neighborhood, language, and social network where Omar's political identity carried the greatest weight. A primary poll cited in the original script placed Omar at 49%, Reeves at 32%, and undecided voters at 19%, with the election only 6 weeks away. For the first time, the dominant headline was not that Omar led, but that she had fallen below 50% in a district she had represented since 2018. That was the final reversal of the night, because Omar had called Vance a man performing hardship, while the documents forced voters to examine the performance surrounding her own political operation. She believed the phrase "Hillbilly Cosplay" would expose a fraud, but it instead opened the door to questions about donor money, family businesses, unsupported financial claims, and forms signed under oath. Vance did not defeat the insult by insulting her more effectively, and he did not neutralize her biography by denying its truth or importance. He simply waited, opened the laptop, counted the doors, displayed the forms, and forced the audience to look at what Omar's performance had been designed to keep outside the frame. She wanted 2 minutes of laughter, received 47 minutes of arithmetic, and discovered too late that numbers do not care who delivers the punchline.